Hello, LinkedIn. It took a couple of seconds for me to go live there. I'm not sure what happened. The first time that has happened. I'm always reluctant as well to say good afternoon because I know there are some people tuning in from different parts of the world. And my lovely guest today, Bev Attfield, is one of those people as well. So she is, I think it's 8 a.m. your time, Bev, is it? Yeah, 8
That's right.
a.m.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
Good
early.
morning from West Coast Canada.
Exactly. This is it. This is it. So, Bev and I recorded an episode of the podcast. Now, it's a few months since we recorded it because I did a bit of a backlog of all of the podcasts before I went remote working in Tenerife for the month because I knew I wasn't going to bring in my equipment over there to be recording the podcast while I was away. So I did a lot of recording of the podcast. So that episode actually came out a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't yet listened to the full episode, it is the link to the full episode is in the comments. For anyone who's watching live, feel free to post your comments or any questions that you have, and Bev and I will be happy to address those. For the purposes of this, probably next 10 or 15 minute discussion about some of the key points that we talked about during the podcast episode, we covered a lot of ground. I think the podcast was around an hour or so. And we, Bev said she listened back and you got good value for money on that one because we covered a lot of ground. And I was looking through my notes. I have 4 pages of notes from that particular episode. So we definitely covered a lot. Bev, do you want to kind of introduce yourself? I know you've had a few changes since we actually recorded the episode. So there's maybe some things that you might want to update people on as well.
Yeah, thanks, Aoife. It's lovely to be back chatting with you. It's been a few months, like you said, and some things have changed for me personally. And in my quest for being happier at work, I made a change. I left my prior role at Jostle, and I've joined a group called Within People. And we're a group of global business strategists that are helping clients around the world with all sorts of culture and leadership problems. And we're really setting out to help people find purpose and grow. And that really speaks to me on an individual level as I'm continuing to understand what it is about my work-life integration that I'm building, that I'm aiming for, moving into this more self-managed, fully dispersed type environment is very liberating. Like I've, you and I were chatting before we went live about just the shift that you make from being an employee to being self-employed and being able to be in control of every part of your day. And even though I had the privilege of a lot of flexibility in my prior job, there was always this expectation that you're checking in, that you've got a boss, there's a hierarchy, you've got timesheets, you've got a set amount of time off. There's just a lot that's out of your control as an employee. And I just feel like I've really shifted into this feeling of much greater autonomy and being able to just craft my day as it suits my life, which is making me very, very happy. So this is it's been a great change to start the year, and I'm just looking forward to, as I experience this, really starting to write about and share my experience, because I think there's a lot that we can learn. Even large organizations can be making shifts to creating greater autonomy and freedom for people who work there. I've been journaling my experience. I'm looking forward to putting that into some sort of, I don't know what sort of content coming up, but something to just, let others experience it through me and to just help us start to really reframe work, right? Because that's where that's what unlocks the happiness, I think. So anyhow, over to you.
Well, no, I was going to say it's really interesting that you say about this idea of autonomy. There's a lot to unpack there, and I know we're going totally off topic in relation to what we spoke about on the podcast, but I think it's interesting to talk about these things. When I first started my own business, similar to yourself, Bev, I had worked as an employee for a very long time, and this shift in mindset, like, it was a huge growth journey. It still is a journey now. And this idea of autonomy, it's one of our basic human needs, essentially one of our basic psychological human needs, and one of the areas that I did my research on for my master's a few years ago. Now, interestingly, and I didn't cover this in my master's specifically, but it came up in one of the other papers that I read, and I thought this was quite interesting, and it was the balance. So it's not just about giving people autonomy. Sometimes you can have too much autonomy, and it depends on what the individual wants and needs. And I find with a lot of entrepreneurs, the autonomy is brilliant and it's what they want. They want the freedom and the flexibility. But when you have too much autonomy, that can actually be detrimental as well. It's not as detrimental. Like if you don't have enough autonomy, it means you're being micromanaged, you're being kind of controlled. You have kind of a lesser sense of choice and control over what you do and how you do it. But if you create an environment where you know what the expectations are, so if you're working for yourself, then it's setting out plans and goals and following those. We've got a fulfillment and meaning in work is very close to my heart. So Pat Finnerty has commented there. Thank you so much, Pat, for sharing that. We've kind of gone off the topic of fulfillment very temporarily. It's kind of related, but it's just not what we talked about on the podcast itself. But it is something that I'm hugely interested in. And it was the same for the other psychological needs as well. You can have too much or too little of the need satisfaction, and it really depends on the individual. So I would suggest for anyone listening today, whether it's live or on the replay, that you consider where you're feeling happy in work, but where you're feeling a sense of frustration, and that will probably indicate to you where your needs are not being met. And autonomy, I think, is a big one. It's really, really important to have that sense of choice and control. And you'll know when you don't have it, because you feel like you're kind of being told what to do, or you don't have that sense of freedom over what it is that you're doing. But maybe we kind of skip back to the topic of the podcast, the topic at hand. And you had some really great insights to share on the podcast. And I mentioned, so for anyone who's kind of come in a little bit late, the podcast, the full episode link is in the comments below. So if you want to click on that and listen to the full episode, once you're finished listening to the live or finish watching the replay as well, that would be really great. So Bev, some of the things that we covered, we did talk about flexibility actually, and flexibility I think was one of the big things, and how we talked about Adam Grant and what he talks about in relation to the Great Resignation being the great reinvention, reimagination,
reprioritization.
I was like, what was that again? There's so many different things.
There have been many spins on it come out of late. So
the great reprioritization, and how flexibility is becoming increasingly important. If you're not offering flexibility to employees, then you're limiting your pool of talent, if you like. And I would love to do some more research. And if anyone knows of this, I've been kind of talking about it not for very long, but it is something I'd love to research more into, because I know that research has been done in Canada in relation to women leaving the workplace because of the pandemic, essentially. I'm not sure that research has been done in Ireland. So that's something, if anyone has any stats around that, I'd love to hear them. If not, then I'm gonna do it myself.
Yeah, and I think it's, if we're thinking about fulfillment and staying on topic here, I think that things like flexibility and autonomy are absolutely drivers of feeling that you are fulfilled at work and in life, right? And I think that's why we spent the time we did in the podcast talking about those aspects of what it feels like to be at work.
Yeah.
How does it feel to be controlled? How does it feel to have a micromanaging boss? How does it feel when you basically have to clock in and clock out? I think we've heightened our awareness around how that used to feel and why we don't want to go back to that kind of framework and that kind of environment in our workplaces now. And we've talked a lot about the Great Resignation, and lots of, as we said, lots of people are talking about it in with different definitions of what it is. But at the heart of it, it's just people searching for wanting to have a better experience in their day. That's what it comes down to. That's what we all want.
Yeah.
Whether we're an office worker or a retail worker or a hospitality person or someone in a factory. I think that is ultimately what we all are looking for. So
yeah, definitely.
Focusing in on what the drivers are of that is a very important endeavor.
Yeah, we spend so much of our time at work, doing work, and previously commuting to and from work as well. it takes up so much of our day that if you're not happy doing what you're doing, if you're not getting that sense of fulfillment, and interestingly, and again, slightly beyond what we spoke about on the podcast, but I had a conversation with someone a few years ago, and they were saying about in well, let's call it the olden days, like the way things used to be, especially here in Ireland, the community sort of formed around the church, and you would get your sense of community and your sense of meaning and purpose from attending church and connecting with people in the local community. That's kind of diminished quite a good bit here in Ireland, and people are not getting that same sense anymore. And so you're looking for that elsewhere, and the obvious place to look for that is through work. Because you're spending so much of your time there. So you're looking for purpose and you're looking for meaning through the work that you do. And that's how you are feeling more fulfilled, is by fulfilling that purpose that you see and by contributing to the greater good, let's say. And I think the pandemic gave people the opportunity to sit back and reflect and think how they are contributing to the world. And is this really how I want my life to be on a day-to-day basis? You know, we're kind of getting quite deep here now, which we didn't necessarily go that deep on the podcast itself. But I think it's really important to talk about these things in an open way. And, you know, a lot of people that I talk to, I don't necessarily do an awful lot of one-to-one work anymore, but I have conversations with people all the time about this kind of stuff. And it's, people think that they're too afraid. They're too afraid because they don't think that they'll find what they're looking for, that it doesn't exist, that they're going to fail, that, you know, they're just, people are really, really afraid to actually make that change. And I always say, if you can grow your own self-awareness and know what it is that really is going to light you up, then it's going to make it easier to find what it is that you're looking for. And if you just take that time to kind of journal, to reflect a little bit, then you can really find that, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I think it is easier for some than others. Like, yeah. I think that there are a lot of people who are just in, you know, hourly wage jobs, who are doing the work that they have to do because that's what they need to do to get by. And yeah, I think we've got to be careful as we talk about these topics to be thinking about everyone.
Yeah.
And I found that a lot of my conversations, especially in the sort of the thick of the pandemic, when we were talking about what was so difficult, was we were pretty much talking about office workers. We were talking about people who were at their desks one day and in their homes the next. And that wasn't everybody's experience. And so
I'm guilty of that, because that's my own personal experience. And that tends to be who I work with and who my clients are and who I
100%.
Yeah. But
yeah, so it's interesting just to try and keep a much broader mindset. And obviously when it comes to the problem solving of it, it's much easier if you can, you know, focus in on a specific demographic, because you can make the most change in office environments right now with regards to hybrid work and what the experience is like for people. So I understand why we are talking about it in very focused ways, but I think it is worth remembering, if we are building these inclusive workplaces where people can belong, it's not just office workplaces that we should be thinking about.
Factories, it's labs, it's retail, all of that. An interesting point that you made there, Bev, and I just want to pick up on it. You know, you're working in a particular job, you don't necessarily like it, but you're doing it so you can support your family, or you're doing it because you feel like you have to. And I always like to reframe those kind of things to, you choose to, for X, Y, and Z reason. So for anything that you're doing, like if you don't have enough time, you know, oftentimes we say we don't have enough time in the day, or we don't have time to watch a TV show, or to read a book, or to do an exercise, or whatever it might be. But it's always about a choice. Like, I'm choosing to spend my time in this way. I'm choosing to, and if you reframe it to, I'm choosing to work in this job so that I can support my family, it makes it feel a little bit more like you have that choice, rather than like, I have to do this, and that you don't have a choice about it, but it's the choice that you're making. And I suppose it goes back to this idea of autonomy that we talked about, that if you give yourself that choice and say, even just reframe your language, even if it doesn't feel like you have a choice, but you just reframe your language, then I think it can make a huge difference. I don't know if you've encountered that before, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I am definitely a big proponent. I think it really ties into a stoic way of moving through the world where you control what you can and you don't try and control what you can't. And I think that some of us are in jobs where, yes, we do have a choice to make a change. And if we're miserable, well, that's on us. We need to make the change.
Yeah.
I guess I would be a little bit cautious about some people just aren't equipped to make the change. They're not able to make a move because they don't have the credentials or the training or the money to go back to school. Or and so maybe what that conversation becomes about for me is then, well, how are we creating equity and fairness in the opportunities that people have and the choices that people can make? Like, how are we leveling up to make sure that every person has equal access to the same opportunities and the ability to make choices for their lives and for their families? So again, we're probably starting down a philosophical pathway here, but I think it is connected to the feeling that I've sensed around, we've got to make some structural and architectural changes to how organizations are set up so that we are giving people equal access to learning and development so that they can go on and do the next great thing for themselves and for their lives. But there's a lot of people who are just kept down, not by their own choice. People who don't actually have the luxury of choice. Like, they can't actually make the choice to go, I'm quitting my job today and I'm going to go look for another job tomorrow. Like, they just don't have the luxury of that. So I think it's a difficult conversation to have because it's not straightforward, I don't think.
Yeah, it's tough that some people they're not actually in a position to make a change. Just in terms of like wrapping things up for this afternoon or this morning in your case, any final thoughts on if you were to give or to offer someone a piece of advice around finding fulfillment at work? Is there kind of one piece of advice or a couple of things that you could share?
Yeah, I'm happy to share from my own experience. I'm not sure that it's necessarily advice, but just be comfortable with discomfort and try new things and do things that maybe you don't feel like that's naturally what you want to spend your time doing, but it allows you to form a lovely relationship, or it gives you some knowledge that lets you expand your horizons. I've been quite fortunate. I feel like my career has grown and my life has unfolded with a bit of serendipity in it, but I also feel like it's because I'm not afraid of change. I'm not afraid to step out of something and try something new, and as I've matured, to declare that I actually don't have an answer and that I don't know what it's going to be like to be in this place of discomfort. I wasn't like that always in my earlier career. I was very determined and very much strong-willed and thought I knew where I was headed and that I knew everything about the world. But luckily, I've softened in that position.
The more you know, the more you know you don't know.
Exactly. So I just, and with, this change that I just recently made with my deciding to work in a very different way, I'm completely out of my depth in some respects. I'm petrified some days. I don't know what it's going to be like, but in that there is exhilaration and there is fun and there's excitement, and I'm surrounded by amazing human beings who are supporting me and loving me and sharing, my journey with me. So I'm very fortunate with where I find myself, but it's taken some work, and I think that's the key. You got to do the work.
Yeah, definitely. I think doing the work and being uncomfortable, I think, are the two key takeaways. I think being uncomfortable is, like, it's so easy to stay where you are comfortable, where you know things, where you have all the answers. But when you start to grow and develop, that's when the real growth actually begins. And I think naturally as humans, we want to take that, we want to grow, but we're also inclined to stay in that comfortable position that we've given ourselves as well. So it's a funny one, I think. But I think we'll leave it at that. We're nearly at 20 minutes now, which is a little bit longer than I anticipated, but still always a great conversation with you, Bev.
Always.
We'll absolutely keep in touch anyway. And thanks everyone for tuning in, whether you're live. And Pat, I see, has made another comment about being part of something bigger than yourself. I think, it's really important to feel like you're part of that something bigger. Definitely. So thanks for tuning in live. If you're catching the replay, and definitely put your comments or your questions below, and myself or Bev will be happy to answer them for you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time. Great to chat.